much. Can you hear me? Can everyone hear me? As a preliminary remark, I would like to say that if Viktor Cherkesov from the Russian Duma had been able to come, unfortunately had a problem, could not come. This meeting might have been an approximation to what Ken Coates tried to do in 1991. And unfortunately, what he was trying to do then was stopped by the coup d'etat in the Soviet Union, so it could not proceed. But in any case, we are proceeding now in our own way. The point of departure for this conference is the report on the environment, security and foreign policy, presented by Mrs. Maja Griterin in the European Parliament on the 14th of January 1999, A4 000599, for the Committee on Foreign Affairs, Security and Defence Policy. We're grateful to those who achieved it. We should have a photograph of her in now. The time of the conference will be explained at the end, and conclusions will commence with an overview. Weather modification has been at the focus of hopes and dreams ever since nomadism gave way to cultivation of the land. The assumption must have been that the power to control the weather could make the difference between surviving or perishing. But it was only in the 19th century that experiments began to make the dreams a reality, primarily in the USA, Russia, Germany, and now China. The first documents date from 1877, when a Harvard University professor, Nathaniel Shaler, proposed a rerouting of warm ocean currents to melt the northern hemisphere's polar ice cap. Since then, there has been a long series of projects with strange titles, from Nuke the Artic in 1945 to Project Argus, Project Skywater, Starfish, Popeye, etc. Weather modification and environmental warfare have been discussed since the early 1960s. But it's only been since the 1990s that the subject has been presented as programs, plans, and activities. The landmark document is the American Academy of Sciences Policy Implications of Greenhouse Warming of 1992. It was also at the beginning of the 1990s there appeared on the scene the HAARP project, High Frequency Active Oral Research Program, which is described by the A4000599 report as a weapons system that disrupts the climate, to be regarded as a serious threat to the environment with an incalculable impact on human life. Another key document on the use of weather as a weapon, this time not a condemnation but a recommendation, is the report presented in 1996 to the United States Air Force entitled The Weather as Force Multiplier, Owning the Weather in 2025. The activities listed in this paper include precipitation enhancement, storm enhancement, precipitation avoidance, a whole lot of things. I mean, because we're running short of time, I won't list all the activities. The point is, these levels could include unilateral actions, participation in a security framework such as NATO, membership in an international organization such as the UN, or participation in coalition, assuming that in 2025 our national security strategy includes weather modification. Its use in our national military strategy will naturally follow, says this report. Besides the significant benefits that an operational capability would provide, another motivation to produce weather modification is to deter and counter potential adversaries. In the 1990s and upwards, there was an intense public debate on global warming, on climate change, culminating with the 2009 Copenhagen Summit and the preceding ClimateGate scandal, which exposed instances of fraud amongst climate scientists in promotion of geoengineering as the most politically feasible and economically rational solution to global warming climate change and as an alternative to reducing carbon dioxide emissions. Geoengineering is defined as the deliberate and large-scale intervention in the Earth's climatic system to reduce global warming. Divides broadly into two categories: carbon dioxide removal and solar radiation management. At this conference we'll discuss only the second category, solar radiation management and stratospheric aerosol spraying. That is to say, attempts to offset the effects of greenhouse gases by causing the Earth to absorb less solar radiation. The words deliberate and large scale are important. Large scale distinguishes geoengineering from local cloud seeding programs to induce rainfall, a practice that goes back many years and once generated a huge amount of litigation. It's a different problem from geoengineering. Deliberate is of relevance because deliberate pollution is in a different legal category from pollution caused as an inadvertent side effect of other economic or military activity. In the discussions of recent years on the effects of aircraft emissions on the global climate, what has been systematically downplayed or obscured is the implications of a change that is transforming pollution from aircraft from being an unwanted nuisance into being a solution to what are identified as problems of global warming or climate change. One of the first widely advertised declarations of geoengineering policy was Edward Teller's 1997 Sunscreen for Planet Earth. Despite being a climate change skeptic, Teller proposed the use of geoengineering to solve a problem he said he was not convinced was a real problem. Because official policy globally is to claim that geoengineering programs are still at the theoretical stage, many, perhaps most people, apparently believe this is true. But geoengineering, or something that corresponds exactly to what geoengineering proposals would be like if implemented, is occurring with devastating effects. Over vast swathes of this planet, thousands, indeed millions of eyewitnesses are reporting horizon-to-horizon aircraft trails that slowly expand and merge until the entire sky is covered with a blanket of artificial cloud. In parallel to this, elements such as barium, aluminium, strontium and manganese are showing up in lab tests of precipitation in lethal quantities across the globe. The soil pH has been so radically changed in the forests of the USA Pacific Northwest that tests have indicated a 1,500% increase in alkalinity. This was all, we heard all this yesterday in, those of us who were here, in Michael Murphy's film. So I won't repeat it because in any case we have a time problem. The Arctic Methane Emergency Group recently called for emergency geoengineering to avert a planetary catastrophe unfolding in the Arctic. This is represented as an attempt to stop implosion of the ice cap and mass expulsion of methane. In the midst of all this metal showing up in soil and water, forests are suffering huge losses. Forest fires are out of control in the Northern Hemisphere. Last August, over 74 million acres burned in Siberia alone. Many other countries have had prolonged states of emergency from wildfires. Drought is also reaching epidemic levels. The spraying appears to be disrupting all natural weather patterns, shredding the ozone layer, poisoning the air with microscopic metal and chemical nanoparticles that are extremely damaging to the human body. The damage done to the planet appears to have reached a critical point. Massive methane release has been triggered on the East Siberian shelf of the Arctic. The methane release is a global game changer, with potential consequences that make it a threat to the existence of higher forms of life on Earth. Only a few years ago, geoengineering proposals were advanced in a disingenuous, almost self-mocking way and received with a similar lack of seriousness. Mainstream climate scientists would say, discussing such craziness only serves to encourage it. So discussion was discouraged. Now public debate has shifted away from whether the proposals deserve to be taken seriously and has moved on to economics, because it said that solar radiation management is cheap, with costs estimated at less than $5 billion US a year, as opposed to 200 to 2,000 billion a year for reduction in carbon dioxide emissions. Who are the players? The Raytheon Corporation, who appear to be doing weather modelling for the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Association and the National Weather Service. Another player is the Lockheed Martin Corporation, which also has a heavy investment in the weather modification business and carries out weather modelling for the Federal Aviation Administration. Is geoengineering a reasonable strategy for combating global warming, or is it a potentially disastrous measure with lethal consequences? It's advertised to the general public as a method for mitigating global warming, but is this in fact its real purpose, or its primary purpose? The unresolved status of geoengineering under international law was investigated in the mid-90s by the environmental lawyer Prodansky. Among the questions he raised were, who should make geoengineering decisions? Should all countries participate in decision-making? How should liability and compensation for damage be handled? Legally, schemes to inject particles into the atmosphere are extremely problematic because the atmosphere above any country is part of its airspace. Nations lay claim to their airspace and may act on the claims, for example, by shooting down aircraft. Geoengineering activity in the atmosphere could be viewed as infringements of national sovereignty. Obviously, the simplest way of dealing with legal problems of this kind, pending negotiation of the necessary adjustments to international law, is to deny that any such activity is occurring. One might imagine that those who dispute the reality of anthropogenic climate change would oppose programs whose declared reason for existence is to mitigate anthropogenic climate change. Mostly, however, this is not happening. Some formerly prominent anthropogenic climate change skeptics have become advocates of geoengineering. Other skeptics deny the more extreme type of geoengineering will ever be feasible. The American climate scientist John Christie, for example, said recently when asked, "I don't think geoengineering will happen. It's too expensive, too uncertain in its results. Who would be liable when if something goes wrong?" John Christie would not have mentioned geoengineering at all if he had not been specifically asked, because his public role is to pursue the climate change debate with other scientists who take the opposite positions to him and argue that anthropogenic climate change is a reality. Climate change skeptics and proponents or opponents of geoengineering do not talk to each other about geoengineering. If they argue, it will be about climate change. John Christie says that geoengineering is not going to happen. A geoengineer such as Paul Crutzen will say that it's because of the attitudes of people like Christie, specifically his climate change skepticism, that Crutzen and others are obliged to make their Plan B proposals for spraying sulfur in the atmosphere. Both sides point the finger at the other. The part of the scenario formerly assigned to the ecologists was the assertion there is a problem of anthropogenic climate change. This was what the ecological organizations focused on, marginalizing the so-called conspiracy theorists who tried to introduce other issues. The task of marginalizing was made easier by the fact that the majority of chemtrails activists have been and remain anthropogenic climate change skeptics. In the 1960s, the US Air Force carried out top-secret weather modification programs in Southeast Asia. But one of the side effects of America's military defeat in Vietnam was a shift in the balance of forces in the 1970s between civilians and the military that made possible the beginnings of legal regulation. One of the American congressmen who worked for adoption of the Environmental Modification Convention expressed fears that it may become feasible to initiate weather modification projects without being detected, raising the possibility of clandestine use of geophysical warfare, where a country doesn't know if it has been attacked. Objections of this kind carried weight, and in 1978 the Environmental Modification Convention came into force, banning the use of weather modification techniques for the purpose of inducing damage or destruction. The existence of the Environmental Modification Convention has made it necessary for there to be a similar conceptual transformation to that already noted with pollution, which has been turned from a problem into a solution. Damage and destruction now has to be identified as what environmental modification is aimed at preventing, not what it is aimed at causing. One of the best known opponents of geoengineering is the etc. group, which in Nagoya in 2010 at the UN Conference on Biodiversity achieved a moratorium on most forms of geoengineering. A moratorium which has, however, been ignored in the same way that other relevant legislation has been ignored. In February, Skyguards interviewed one of the founding members of the etc. group, Pat Mooney, but due to time constraints today, we aren't able to discuss what he said. You can find the complete text of the interview in the dossier we distributed. In an article I wrote some years ago called Climate Change, Jekylls and Hydes, I drew attention to a distinction between two types of activism. On the one hand, activism that is supported by the mainstream media, that works through the United Nations, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the big international environmental organizations such as Greenpeace, Friends of the Earth, and the WWF. And on the other hand, activism of the kind that has led to this conference today, an activism that starts not from what we hear said about global warming on radio and television or read in the mainstream press, but more from what we see with our own eyes in the sky. It's hard to know which of these types of activism involves larger numbers of people, because the first so-called respectable type of activism is organized and centralized with offices, spokespersons, hierarchies, funding, all the things in short that we lack. But I suspect, given the millions and millions of references, photographs and analyses to be found on the internet, focusing on the questions we raise, that there are more of us, many more. It would be an understatement to say that relations between these two types of activism are bad. They are very bad, despite a thematic convergence of the last couple of years, so that groups that were once talking exclusively of global warming have now begun to express views on and mostly against geoengineering. Only 2 weeks ago there were discussions on geoengineering in the context of what is called climate justice at the World Social Forum in Tunisia, and there's a friend here who has come from that conference and can tell us about it personally, I suppose. If the political parties, parliaments, mainstream and alternative mass media and the World Social Forums are not willing to bear the political cost of honesty in relation to geoengineering, we citizens must assume this responsibility ourselves. civil society must become organized to confront what, a generation ago and in a preceding phase of the activity of the very same weapons laboratories, was being called exterminism by the British writer and activist Edward Thompson. Given the seriousness of the situation and the way populations are being left defenseless, every potentially efficacious measure, judicial, political and economic, must be explored. Public health and public security are assets to be safeguarded and which must be safeguarded. This is what Skyguards, the main organizer of this conference, is about. While ways may have been found of circumventing the Environmental Modification Convention by redefining reality and representing aggression to the world's television audiences as protection, or at least attempted protection, there are other conventions, such as the Articles Convention, granting the public right of access to environmental information, that can and should be enlisted in response to deception of this kind. Thank you for your attention.